Morning at Westmart was heavy with silence. Customers wandered and eyes' tired lips pressed shut. No greetings, no warmth, only the scraping of carts on dirty tiles. At Register 4, Maribel Sloan bent over the scanner. Her hands shook so hard the barcodes wouldn't read. She blinked fast, but the tears broke loose anyway, sliding down her cheeks in front of strangers. She bit her lip, tried to hide it with her sleeve smearing mascara across her skin. Her breath caught sharp and uneven like someone drowning in plain sight. Mrs. Holloway slammed a carton of milk on the counter, muttered in disgust, and walked out. The line of customers shifted, restless, embarrassed. No one spoke. Then Curtis Maddox stormed out, clipboard raised. The crack against the counter made Maribel flinch. His voice tore through the silence. Pathetic. Crying on shift again. At the far aisle a man watched. Silent. Harlan West. A man stood half-hidden near the end of the produce aisle. His coat was old, the seams frayed his cap, pulled low until the shadow covered most of his face. Nothing about him asked for attention, yet he noticed everything. The shelves half-empty the floor, dull and sticky the air, stale with the smell of burnt coffee. Customers walked past without a nod, without even raising their eyes, as if the place itself had taught them to keep silent. Employees moved like ghosts. Shoulders hunched, eyes lowered, words clipped to a single syllable if spoken at all. No laughter, no welcome, no pride. The man's hand tightened inside his pocket. The tendons stood out against the fabric knuckles, hardening, but his face gave nothing away. He seemed only another customer lost in thought. No one in that store knew who he was or what name lay behind the worn jacket. For them, he was just another stranger pausing by the canned goods. But he was not a stranger at all. He was the one who had once promised that no worker would ever stand alone in his company. And now, in silence, he returned to find that promise broken. Memory rose without warning, sharper than the light flickering above the aisle. He saw himself, decades younger, crouched on the same kind of floor. His knees ached from hours of scrubbing tiles blackened by grease. His shirt clung to his back, drenched with sweat, yet his hands kept moving raw and cracked, lifting crates of potatoes, arranging apples one by one so every customer felt welcomed. Back then, he had nothing but a broom, a mop, and a vow whispered into the empty store when no one was listening. No one who works here will be treated like I once was. No one will be made small. That vow had lit his way through years of building through mornings that began before dawn and nights that ended long after others had gone home. It had carried him from a corner grocery to a chain of stores bearing his name. But looking now at the hollow faces bent over their tasks, at the silence that pressed down heavier than any crate, he felt the sting of betrayal, not from others, but from himself. What he had sworn to protect was slipping through his fingers. His past stood in front of him, bright and alive, but his present was gray, drained a place where tears fell and no one dared to speak. In his pocket, the memory of paper still weighed on him. A plain envelope, no return address, only a scrawl across its surface, shaky as though written in haste. Someone is being pushed to the edge. Look before it's too late. He had laid that envelope on a polished conference table weeks ago. Around him, regional directors had chuckled, brushing it aside like dust. One smirked, probably a kid whining about hours. Another added, if we chased every complaint, nothing would ever get done. Their laughter had echoed smug and careless. He had stayed silent then, pocketing the words, but he never forgot the tremor in those lines. That was not a complaint. It was a cry. Now standing among shelves that sagged with workers who moved as if carrying invisible chains, he knew the letter had spoken truth. Every sigh, every hunched back, every unshed tear confirmed it. His jaw clenched. The letter had warned him. He had waited, and waiting had allowed rot to spread. The voices of power had dismissed it as weakness, but what he saw now was not weakness. It was people crushed into silence, punished for being human. He lifted his eyes across the store. Maribel at the register, eyes swollen. Elias stocking shelves without a word. June trying to smile, though her hands trembled. The letter was not a rumor. It was standing right before him in flesh and bone. June Carver stood by the entrance lips, pulled into something that resembled a smile but had none of its warmth. Her eyes darted down as soon as a customer passed. No welcome, no spark. The woman had worked years in this store, yet now even her greeting carried the weight of resignation. A toppled sign leaned against a bin, its letters shouting about discounts no one bothered to notice. It had fallen days ago, perhaps, and still it lay crooked, an afterthought in a place that once prized order. On the floor near the produce section, an onion had rolled away, its skin dried and brittle edges curling like paper. No one picked it up. Customers stepped around it as though it belonged there, part of the decay. The air carried no life, only exhaustion. Patrons drifted in and left quickly, carts' half-filled shoulders heavy with irritation. From where he stood, Harlan took it all in. His chest sank under the sight. This was not the store he had built. What he saw now was a body without a pulse, a shell stripped of spirit. The crash of cardboard and cans broke the dull quiet. A box had slipped from Elias Crow's arms, tumbling across the aisle. He scrambled to gather the scattered goods, face flushed. Before he could finish, Curtis Maddox was there. Clipboard raised, eyes hard, his voice slashed through the store. Useless. Can't even carry a box. The words were sharp enough to make customers pause. One woman shook her head, pushed her cart away without a word. Another murmured something under her breath and left her basket behind. Elias stayed crouched, hands fumbling. His ears burned crimson. He pressed his lips tight, forcing himself not to speak. Each second stretched like punishment. Around him, co-workers froze in place. No one stepped forward. No one dared to meet his eyes. Their silence weighed heavier than Curtis's voice, a silence drilled into them until fear became second nature. Curtis snorted, slammed the clipboard against his thigh, and stalked off. The sound of his shoes against the tile was the only thing that moved. Elias picked up the last can with trembling fingers, jaw-clenched shame etched deep across his face. And at the far aisle, Harlan watched fury hidden beneath a mask of calm. The break room smelled faintly of stale coffee and disinfectant. Maribel Sloane sat hunched over a table, her shoulders shaking. Her forehead pressed to her arms as tears slid unchecked onto her sleeve. She whispered into the crook of her elbow words so soft they barely carried. "I'm sorry, my son. I can't keep up. I'm failing you." From her pocket slipped a folded paper, creased and thin, a medical bill. The numbers glared against the page, brutal and unyielding. She clutched it, then let it fall back to the table as another sob broke free. In the corner, Elias sat, stiff eyes on the floor. His voice was hoarse low. "We stay quiet. That's the only way. Speak up, and they cut your hours until you can't survive." The air was dense, suffocating, thick with words unspoken. Every sigh, every sniffle hung heavy. The room held not just fatigue, but surrender. No laughter, no chatter, only the faint sound of a woman's broken breathing and the scratch of Elias's shoe against the linoleum. Outside the door, unseen, Harlan leaned against the wall. His fists pressed deep into his pockets, nails digging into his palms. Each muffled sob pierced deeper than any shout could. He understood now, silence here was not peace. It was despair, enforced and absolute. Near the frozen foods section, a young mother balanced a restless child on her hip, her cart pushed to the side. She waited at the service counter, eyes flicking to the clock, shifting her weight from foot to foot. Minutes stretched, 10 of them, with no one coming to help. The baby whimpered, tugging at her sleeve. Finally, the woman let out a weary sigh. She lifted the child higher, abandoned the cart with its half-filled groceries, and walked toward the exit. Her steps were steady, but the tilt of her shoulders carried defeat. Curtis Maddox passed by, saw the cart left stranded, and smirked. Instead of moving to assist, he turned his head, eyes narrowing with indifference as though the customer had never existed. Employees caught the moment. They exchanged fleeting glances, fear and shame in equal measure before bowing their heads, quickly pretending not to notice. Their silence was its own confession. At the far end, Harlan West watched. His jaw stiffened. The anger in his eyes flickered, but he remained still hidden behind his mask of anonymity. The scene before him was not just poor service, it was collapse, both in spirit and in duty. Later that afternoon, a young clerk approached Curtis, twisting her hands nervously. Her voice was thin, nearly breaking. "Sir, I need to switch a shift. My little boy's in the hospital. Please, just this once." Curtis didn't even look up from his clipboard. His lips curled into a cruel half-smile. "Switch a shift. Better idea, quit altogether. Saves us the trouble." The words landed heavier than any shout. The clerk's face drained of color. She pressed both hands to her mouth as tears flooded her eyes. A sob burst out as she fled down the corridor, her uniform crumpled, her dignity shattered. Around her, co-workers froze, eyes wide with horror, yet not one moved. Their shoulders drew tight, their gazes dropped. No one dared comfort her. They had all learned the cost of speaking. From the edge of the aisle, unseen, Harlan stood rooted. His chest ached as if the insult had struck him instead. Each syllable Curtis uttered revealed not leadership, but cruelty refined into policy. The weight pressed down hard. This was no longer mismanagement. This was deliberate harm. The break room door was thin, but every sound carried through. Harlan leaned against the wall just beyond it, hidden in shadow. Inside, muffled voices trembled into fragments. A woman's sobs broke the air, sharp, uneven gasps that cracked like glass. Between them came words fractured by breath. I can't do this anymore. Every shift feels like a punishment. Another voice lower added, Speak out and they'll cut you off until you starve. Harlan pressed his fist deeper into his pocket. His nails dug into his palm until the skin burned. Sweat formed across his brow, cold, yet his body was rigid with heat. He closed his eyes, letting the words sink into him one by one. This wasn't laziness. It wasn't incompetence. It was fear, planted and cultivated, choking every voice until even tears had to hide behind closed doors. His breath slowed, heavy as stone. In that moment, he knew the truth. What rotted here was not business practice, it was something darker. Not a failing store, but a place of quiet abuse, sealed by silence. And silence, he realized, was the loudest cry of all. The next morning, he came not in his coat, but in the plain blue uniform every worker wore. A plastic badge was pinned over his chest. It read only one word, Hal. Curtis Maddox spotted him at once. The manager's eyes narrowed, assessing before he barked a laugh. New meat, he muttered. Without a welcome, without instruction, Curtis tossed a slip of paper toward him. Heavy stock to unload. Piles of boxes left in the corridor blocking carts and feet. Work meant to bend backs and silence questions. No one asked his name. No one cared where he came from. They turned away, each carrying their own weight, unwilling to risk even a glance of curiosity. So Hal bent his shoulders and lifted. Cardboard dug into his arms, the strain biting into his spine. He worked as though he belonged at the bottom. In that moment, he did. Behind the hum of freezers and the scrape of pallets, his disguise held. No one guessed who had joined their ranks. The man who had built the sign above their heads now walked beneath it as if he were nothing. Stacks of cereal boxes wobbled as they worked side by side. Elias Crow, tall and thin, pushed his glasses up the bridge of his nose, eyes flicking toward the aisles to make sure Curtis wasn't near. His voice slipped out low, barely more than breath. Here. If you've got kids, or if you're sick, your hours disappear. Doesn't matter how long you've worked. They cut you out until you can't afford to stay. Hal grunted softly, keeping his gaze on the boxes, hands steady, pretending the words meant nothing. Inside, every syllable lodged deep. Elias shifted another carton, leaned closer. But if you flatter him, if you stay quiet and bow your head, your schedule fills up. You get the hours. That's how it works. He decides who eats and who doesn't. The words were brittle, dangerous, yet spoken with the dull certainty of truth lived too long. Elias's shoulders slumped as he said it, resignation carved into the curve of his back. Hal gave only the faintest nod as though nothing had passed between them. But his mind etched each phrase with the precision of a ledger. Hours as punishment, hours as reward. A system bent not by necessity, but by control. By late evening, Silas Boone staggered under the weight of another shipment. Sweat soaked through his shirt, clinging like chains. His steps dragged legs trembling from 3 shifts strung together without rest. He lifted the final box arms, shaking violently, then his body buckled. The crash echoed down the aisle. Wood splintered, cans scattered. Silas lay on the tiled chest, heaving, face pale as chalk. For a breath, silence. Then Curtis appeared. He didn't kneel, didn't ask. His lips curved into a smirk that cut colder than any order. Too weak, then stay down. We don't need dead weight. The words rang like iron against stone. Employees froze where they stood. June covered her mouth. Elias turned away, fists clenched. No one stepped forward. Fear bound them tighter than pity. Silas tried to rise his hands, slipping on the floor body, folding again. Curtis walked off, leaving him sprawled, the sound of his clipboard tapping against his leg like a drumbeat of contempt. At the edge of the chaos, Hal stood still, every muscle rigid. The scene was proof undeniable, not whispered in corners, but carved in plain sight. What he had heard in sobs and secrets now lay before him in flesh and bone cruelty that called itself management. Silas groaned as Harlan lifted him from the floor. His body was limp-damp with sweat heavy against arms that had once hauled crates in another lifetime. Harlan set him gently onto a chair near the wall. For a moment, silence held the room. No one moved closer. June hovered at the edge, then shrank back. Elias stared at the ground, his fists tight but unmoving. Fear sealed their feet to the tiles. Harlan straightened, scanning the faces around him. His eyes, usually hidden behind a mask of humility, sharpened like glass. The gaze cut through the room, lingering long enough that a few workers shifted uneasily. Something in that look was out of place too steady, too commanding for a man meant to be a nameless recruit. But the moment passed. Harlan lowered his head, turned back to the pallets, and bent once more under the weight of cardboard. The disguise held, but just barely. Underneath, fury pressed against his ribs, demanding to break free. Night draped itself across the store when the last carts were pushed away. In the dim glow of the back office, Harlan sat before the humming computer. The screen blinked, waiting. His fingers hovered, then typed in a code he had never meant to use, an emergency key buried deep in the system. The schedule unfolded line by line, rows of names. Numbers scattered across days. His pulse quickened. Notes appeared beside each entry, written in blunt, careless shorthand: unreliable, not priority, problematic. He leaned closer, the light washing over his face. His hand trembled as he scrolled further, each word colder than the last. Lazy. Too many requests. Cut hours. It was not management, it was a ledger of cruelty disguised as efficiency. His chest hammered. The mouse slipped slightly in his grip, damp with sweat. He knew he was on the edge of something darker than mismanagement. The page in front of him was not numbers. It was evidence. Evidence of a system built to punish. Then her name surfaced, Maribel Sloan. His breath caught as he traced the column. A steady descent week after week. 32 hours, 24, 15, 9. Each figure a knife sliding lower, cutting away her survival. Beside her name, a note glared in black font: not reliable, not priority. He froze. The words blurred for a moment, not from the screen, but from memory. The sight of her wiping tears with the back of her hand, whispering apologies to customers who never asked for them, folding bills she could not pay. He had seen her cracked dignity in the break room, pleading to no one, whispering to her absent son. And here was the root of it. Reduced not by chance, not by error, but by intention. Her downfall had been recorded coldly in a system she could not fight. Harlan sat motionless, his jaw, tight eyes locked on the numbers. What he once dismissed as rumor now stood undeniable. Maribel's tears had been written into policy, and he, the man who had built this company on promises of fairness, had allowed it by turning away. The screen scrolled each name, another blow. June Carver appeared first. Hours stacked mercilessly across the night. Midnight to dawn, 5 days without reprieve. Her note was blunt, sneering from the margin. Complains too much. Then Silas Boone. Shift after shift, double loads stitched together without space to breathe. His entry carried its own quiet verdict: not priority. Likely to quit. Each name carried not just a schedule, but a sentence. The system had been turned into a knife, carving away dignity with cold precision. Harlan leaned back, eyes fixed on the monitor. He saw their faces overlay the lines. June's forced smile at customers while her body wilted under exhaustion. Silas, collapsing ribs heaving on the floor, mocked instead of helped. One by one, their lives had been folded into spreadsheets, each struggle reduced to a tag, each cry erased beneath labels written by an indifferent hand. It was no accident. It was design. He scrolled again, and the contrast cut sharper than any insult. Trusted staff, the ones who laughed at Curtis's jokes, who kept their heads down, who echoed his orders, enjoyed hours untouched. Some had increases, their names highlighted with tags like reliable, priority, worth keeping. Their columns stood steady, a shield against hunger and fear. Bonus notes dangled from the margins, extra shifts, recognition, small rewards that made survival certain. The disparity was brutal. For every Maribel or June stripped bare, there was someone else cushioned, chosen, fed by Curtis's favor. Fairness had no place here. Schedules were not tools of order, but weapons wielded with precision. Harlan's jaw clenched. His teeth ground until his temple ached. The system he once believed could lift people had been twisted into something colder, something designed to sort the obedient from the expendable. The words blurred. Not because he couldn't read them, but because rage clouded every line. Later, in a motel room that smelled faintly of mildew, he sat hunched over a scarred wooden table. The yellow lamp cast a sickly light across his notebook. He wrote down names one after another: Maribel June, Silas Elias, each with the cruel notes that condemned them. His pen pressed harder with every entry until the paper nearly tore. At the center of the page he circled a single name, heavy red ink digging deep: Maribel Sloan. Her tears in front of strangers, her whispered apology in the break room, her desperate wallet with only coins. He had seen her fracture under weight no one should carry, and the system had marked her as not reliable. His eyes blurred. Fatigue pressed down, but so did something heavier: shame. He rubbed at his face, not knowing whether the dampness on his cheeks was sweat exhaustion or grief. There was no going back. What he had uncovered tonight could not be unseen. The choice ahead was no longer whether to act, but how soon. In the quiet of his office, Curtis Maddox leaned back in his chair, the glow of the monitor bright against his smug grin. His fingers tapped quickly, lines of text appearing with ruthless clarity. Operational costs reduced. Profit margins climbing. Strategy working flawlessly. He finished the email with a flourish addressed to the regional board. His eyes lingered on the words cost reduction, savoring them as if they were medals pinned to his chest. With a satisfied click, he hit send. The message was gone, carrying his pride upward, ready to be praised. He reached for his coffee, sipped, and let the bitterness settle on his tongue like victory. Outside the glass wall, employees moved past. One glanced his way, then quickly lowered her gaze. Curtis didn't notice, or perhaps he didn't care. To him, they weren't people-only figures trimmed neatly into his report. He exhaled, pleased. Tomorrow would confirm it. He believed his triumph was complete, the store under his control, the numbers irrefutable. In his mind, the future belonged to him. But outside his door, unseen, another future was already waiting. The next morning, the staff gathered in the main lobby. Shoulders slumped, eyes dull, they formed a reluctant audience. A hush fell over the space as Curtis strode in, clipboard pressed against his chest like a badge of authority. His voice rang out sharp and rehearsed. You've all seen the changes. Tighter schedules, fewer wasted hours, stronger margins. That's how we survive. That's how I keep this place alive. The workers stood in silence. No applause, no nods of agreement. Only the sound of feet shifting on the tile, the weight of exhaustion pulling them lower. Curtis mistook their quiet for respect. He smiled, lifted his chin, his tone rising with pride. This is leadership. Sacrifice from the weak so the strong can carry forward. At the edge of the crowd, Harlan stood unnoticed, head bowed, the plain badge of Hal still pinned to his chest. He heard every word, his hands buried in his pockets, his pulse steady but heavy. The air was taut, stretched thin like a rope about to snap. Everyone felt it, though no one yet knew from which side the break would come. The shrill ring of Curtis's phone shattered the silence. He glanced at the screen, saw the corporate line, and straightened instantly. With a quick gesture, he pressed the device to his ear, voice smooth with false confidence. Yes, sir. Absolutely. The changes are working. Staff may grumble, but results speak louder. Trust me, weak links are being cut. Efficiency is higher than ever. His tone swelled loud enough for the workers nearby to catch every word. Heads lifted slightly, ears straining. The room grew still, all attention fixed on the man boasting into the receiver. Curtis paced, proud lips curling. They're just extras. Dead weight. I've learned how to turn their weakness into numbers the board loves. He chuckled softly, certain he was proving himself indispensable. What he didn't know was that the call had been placed, deliberately arranged by the very man who now stood among the silent crowd. Harlan's gaze didn't shift, but inside his chest the trap tightened. Curtis was speaking his own sentence aloud, and every ear in that room was listening. The bow had bent as far as it could. Now it was ready to break. Curtis's voice grew louder, rising above the rustle of carts and the shuffle of feet. He wanted every ear to catch his words. These employees, the weak ones, they're nothing but excess, dead weight. He paced the floor, one hand gripping his phone, the other waving his clipboard like a sword. I take their weakness, he continued, and I turn it into clean numbers. Numbers the board admires. They love it. They want results, not excuses. The words hit the crowd like stones. Workers froze mid-task. June's hands stopped over a shelf. Elias straightened slowly, his mouth parting in shock. Silas, still pale from exhaustion, stared with hollow eyes. Silence deepened thick with disbelief. A few pulled out their phones, recording discreetly as if needing proof that such cruelty had truly been spoken aloud. Curtis smiled, misreading their stillness as awe. He thought himself untouchable, his arrogance so loud it drowned out the weight of the room. But, in truth, he had dug his own grave, one sentence at a time. From the back of the crowd, movement stirred. A figure stepped out from the shadows of the aisle. His coat hung loose, his cap still low. Then, with deliberate calm, he removed it. The hush thickened. In the light, his face was clear, steady, lined with years of resolve. His hand reached inside his coat and drew out a badge, polished metal, catching the glare of overhead lamps. The engraved letters shone unmistakable: Harlan West, Chief Executive Officer. Gasps rippled. The silence cracked. Harlan's voice rolled through the air, low yet sharp, each word weighted with iron. "You're right, Curtis. Someone from above is listening. And that someone is me." Curtis froze. The color drained from his face. The clipboard in his hand trembled. His mouth opened, but no sound came. The authority he had wielded so brutally shriveled in a single breath. For the first time, the workers looked not at him, but past him to the man who had been among them all along. Whispers broke across the floor like a wave. "The CEO? It's him. He's here." Curtis's knees weakened. The clipboard slipped from his grip, striking the tile with a hollow crack. He bent quickly, but his shaking hands fumbled. The symbol of command he had brandished so often lay useless at his feet. Harlan extended his hand, palm steady, eyes unflinching. "The keys. Curtis." For a long second, Curtis stared at him, chest heaving. His lips moved as if to argue, but the weight of the silence around him smothered the words. Employees stood, rigid eyes locked, waiting. Finally, Curtis reached into his pocket. His hand shook so violently the keys jingled before he even let them go. He dropped them into Harlan's palm. The metallic clatter echoed across the lobby, final and undeniable. The man who had ruled through fear now stood stripped, pale, and trembling with nothing left to grasp. And the workers, silent for so long, felt the air shift. Something had broken. Something new was about to begin. After the keys dropped into Harlan's palm, the store stood still. No applause, no shouts, only silence stretching heavy across the lobby. Workers looked at one another, their eyes wide, uncertain. The sound of the fallen clipboard still echoed in their minds. Harlan closed his fist around the keys, then drew a slow breath. His voice came low but heavy, cutting through the quiet. "I did not come here to hand out favors." Every head lifted. The words struck differently than Curtis's cruelty. They were not commands, not threats, but something heavier, more difficult to name. The workers waited, tense, hearts racing. They had been ruled for so long by fear that even hope felt dangerous. The pause hung sharp, as though the next sentence might decide their fate. The silence was no longer emptiness, it was expectation, thick and almost unbearable. His eyes swept the crowd, not as a judge, but as someone searching for truth. "This store does not need a ruler," he said. "It needs a voice chosen by you, not given by me." Murmurs flickered through the group. Elias shifted, staring down at the floor, his shoulders hunched as if hiding from the weight of those words. June's lips parted, then closed again. Her hands trembled where they clutched her apron. Silas bit down on his lip, the conflict written plainly across his face. They were not used to choice. Choice had been stripped away for so long that even the suggestion of it unsettled them. Harlan's gaze lingered, steady, waiting. The silence tightened again. He would not break it this time. It had to come from them. The keys in his pocket jingled softly as he folded his hands. Authority was his, but decision was theirs. The stillness cracked not with sound, but with glances. One by one, pairs of eyes shifted toward the same figure. Elias was first. He lifted his gaze almost against his will and whispered under his breath, "She deserves it." June followed, nodding slowly, her trembling hands now still. Silas looked from one to the other, his jaw tightening. Then he gave a sharp nod, decisive. A ripple passed through the crowd. Workers who had kept silent for months, who had lived in fear of speaking, now turned in unison. Their eyes rested on Maribel Sloane. She stood near the register, startled by the weight of their stares. Her breath caught chest rising and falling too quickly. She looked behind her as though the choice must be meant for someone else. But no, the room had already spoken without words. For the first time, it was not an order imposed, not a schedule dictated, but a decision born from unity, and all of it pointed toward her. The silence of the room pressed against her chest. Dozens of eyes fixed on her, yet Maribel Sloane felt smaller than she had ever been. She stepped back, almost stumbling, shaking her head. Her voice cracked as it left her throat. "No, not me. I'm nothing but a burden. I cried in front of customers. I made them uncomfortable. I failed." Her hands gripped the hem of her apron so tightly her knuckles turned white. Her eyes, still raw from nights of tears, filled again. Every memory of humiliation, every moment of weakness seemed to rise and choke her in that instant. No one looked away. They didn't pity her. They waited. They waited as though she carried something they had long needed but never dared claim. Harlan West watched her with a steadiness that cut through the storm inside her. His lips curved into the faintest smile, not of pity, but of recognition. Harlan's voice came deep certain. "Maribel, you think weakness disqualifies you. But it is because you have fallen, because you have carried weight no one saw that you understand theirs." The words lingered. Then a whisper stirred at the back of the room, "Maribel." Another followed firmer, "Maribel." Soon it spread a low chant that filled the silence. "Elias June." Silas, one by one they spoke her name until the sound became a tide. Her chest rose and fell in uneven waves. She swallowed hard, blinking through the blur. Then she drew in a long breath, steadied herself, and nodded once. Her voice, hoarse yet steady, broke through the chant. "If you believe in me, then I will not turn my back." The room erupted. Applause, sharp and unrestrained, burst against the walls. Not the polite clapping of obligation, but the sound of people released of chains snapping in unison. And in the center of it all stood Maribel Sloane, no longer trembling, but chosen. The office still smelled of Curtis cheap cologne and stale coffee. The chair creaked under Maribel as she sat her back rigid, her breath uneven. The desk bore scratches from years of indifference, the monitor flickering awake as she pressed the button. The schedule filled the screen. Columns of names, rows of hours, the same grid that had crushed them for months. Her hands hovered trembling over the keyboard. For a moment, fear threatened to pull her back. Then she exhaled and began to type. The first line was deliberate, written slowly, almost carved into the digital space, "Prioritize single mothers." The words glowed on the screen, small but seismic. Behind them, she could already imagine June leaving work before dawn, broke Silas no longer collapsing under endless doubles, Elias allowed to take his child to the doctor without fear. Her fingers steadied. Line after line formed, reshaping what had been weaponized into something that could sustain. The office was still Curtis's in scent and memory, but with every keystroke it became less his and more theirs. The grid stretched across the screen columns, cold and rigid, but Maribel's eyes no longer wavered. She began at the top, erasing nights stacked mercilessly on one another. Consecutive midnight shifts dissolved with a single strike of her keys. She moved on, shifting hours gently, weaving in daylight for parents who had been trapped in the dark for too long. Notes appeared beside their names, not curses but guidance. Notify early for adjustments. Family care respected. Her hands struck the keyboard faster, more assured with every line. The rhythm grew steady, confident the sound of a system being mended. Tears blurred her vision, but they did not stop her. They sharpened her purpose. Each correction felt less like typing and more like stitching wounds closed. The schedule was no longer a weapon. It became what it was meant to be, a structure to support, not to destroy. For the first time she felt the store breathe again. Later she stood before a whiteboard and the break room marker trembling slightly between her fingers. The room filled with the quiet shuffling of workers, each curious, cautious. She drew one firm line across the board, then wrote in large letters, "Schedules exist to support, not to punish." Her signature followed Maribel Sloane. The message hung in the air, heavier than any speech. Employees stepped closer, reading slowly. Eyes glistened. For so long, words on paper had condemned them, but here was a declaration that lifted instead of crushed. June pressed a hand to her lips. Elias nodded faintly. Silas tapped his fist lightly against the table. A few began to clap, hesitant at first, then firmer as though testing the strength of this new promise. At the back, Harlan watched, his gaze softened, pride tempered by relief. For the first time he believed the store could heal without him. The change showed itself not in charts, but in moments. An elderly woman wandered down the frozen aisle, squinting at the shelves. Before she could sigh in defeat, Elias stepped forward. "Can I help you find something, ma'am?" His voice was soft but sure. Her face brightened. It's been so long since anyone asked. Elsewhere, June stacked produce, her voice carrying a faint hum, a melody too quiet for performance, too natural to fake. Silas laughed under his breath as he exchanged words with a father buying bread. It was a small sound, rusty from disuse, but it lingered warmly. The aisles no longer swallowed people whole. They moved with lighter steps, customers pausing not to complain, but to smile. The dull weight that had pressed on the store seemed to lift, replaced by something fragile but alive. Harlan, unseen near the entrance, watched the current shift. He did not write, he did not speak. He simply listened to laughter returning to silence, breaking to the sound of a place remembering how to live. The store did not transform overnight, yet its rhythm was unmistakably different. Shelves, once tilted and neglected, now stood straight, stocked with care. Promotional boards no longer lay forgotten on the floor. They were propped firmly, their edges aligned. Employees moved not with dread, but with intent. Elias walked an elderly customer through the bread aisle, steadying her cart with a quiet smile. June knelt to help a child reach a box of cereal, her laughter breaking the old, suffocating silence. Silas, though still tired, cracked jokes as he stacked crates, his voice carrying like a small fire warming cold air. The sound of the store had changed, no longer the hollow scrape of resignation, but the rising cadence of work done with pride. As Maribel walked past clipboards tucked under her arm, her co-workers lifted their eyes to her. No words were exchanged. Only brief nods, half smiles, and the kind of acknowledgement that spoke louder than speech respect. The place breathed again. A week passed, and the store pulsed with new life. On a quiet afternoon, a man stood beyond the glass doors, coat slung casually over his shoulder. No name tag, no suit, just Harlan West, neither undercover nor commanding, only watching. Through the pane, he saw scenes that numbers could never capture. Customers greeted by name laughter, trading places with exhaustion and the simple ease of people allowed to breathe. A child tugged at his mother's sleeve, pointing excitedly at a small sticker offered by June. Silas carried boxes, but his steps, though heavy, no longer dragged. Harlan's eyes softened. He leaned lightly on the frame, invisible to those inside, and let the warmth of the sight sink into him. The store no longer needed his shadow looming over it. It had found its own balance, its own rhythm. He drew a breath, steady and slow, as though letting go of a weight carried too long. Harlan lingered a moment longer, watching through the glass as sunlight spilled over the polished floor. The chatter of voices inside reached him, faintly fragments of a song, hummed by June, the echo of Elias greeting a customer. It was enough. He lowered his gaze, lips moving in a whisper meant for no one but himself. Perhaps this time. I truly don't need to step inside again. Turning away, his steps were unhurried, each one a release. His reflection slid from the glass, leaving behind only the bustling life within. The staff went on, unaware, their voices rising in harmony of work and trust restored. Harlan's figure diminished slowly along the sidewalk, his shoulders no longer weighed down. At the corner, he paused briefly, the faintest smile curving his lips, not triumphant, but peaceful. Behind him, Westmart continued, not as a machine grinding its people down, but as a place alive with human dignity. And for the first time, he could walk away with ease. The shift wound down aisles, quieting under dimmed lights. Maribel stepped into the break room, the whiteboard still hanging where she had written her first promise. For a moment, she stood still, listening to the faint hum of silence left behind by the day. She uncapped a marker hand, trembling slightly, and wrote beneath the bold words already there, "None of us are expendable." A pause, then one more line, darker, firmer, "Here we will not abandon each other." She set the marker down, inhaling deeply as though sealing the vow with breath alone. The words glowed against the stark surface, not just hers now, but belonging to everyone who would walk through this door. It was no longer a rule. It was a covenant. One by one, workers filtered into the room. June's gaze fell on the board first. She pressed her lips together, knotted eyes glistening. Elias stood behind her, and for the first time in weeks a faint smile broke across his face. Silas stepped closer, reading slowly, then extended his hand to a co-worker beside him. Their palms met in a quiet handshake, heavy with unspoken promise. The atmosphere shifted. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. It spread in glances exchanged in shoulders that lifted in breaths that came easier. The whiteboard no longer bore a single voice. It carried the weight of a team bound not by fear, but by trust returning. For the first time, they stood not as survivors under Curtis, but as a collective reborn. The break room was quiet, the air thick with the warmth of what had just been spoken. Maribel set the marker down her hand, trembling faintly, but the words on the board stood firm. No one among us is expendable. Here we do not abandon each other. The workers lingered, their eyes fixed on those lines. They carried more than policy. They carried survival dignity and hope. And somewhere beyond these walls, others might need to hear it too. Even the smallest mark can speak, "I was here. I mattered." Sometimes it is nothing more than a single dot. Yet even that dot can change silence into testimony and prove no one stands alone.